Hey, Grace Moms, here we are in day 10, and we are in Numbers. Doesn't it feel nice to be done with Leviticus? Oh my. And here we are in Numbers, and the nation of Israel is learning more about God's standards, but also getting a little malcontent with their time in the desert. If you would, let's go to Numbers 11, and let's look at where they're at. So they've been wandering, they've left Egypt. In Egypt, they were slaves. They performed back-breaking labor. They were treated very poorly. Some might have been treated well because, we can't make blanket statements, but for the most part, they were treated very, very poorly. Their children had been slaughtered by Pharaoh, who was afraid that they would overrun them, and yet God still flourished their numbers. They were deprived of basic human rights, and God miraculously led them out of slavery into the desert where he was going to give them freedom. He parted the Red Sea for them. Wow, right? And he set up a tabernacle, and they saw clearly where the presence of God was, because there was a pillar of fire that they could follow at night and a cloud that would descend during the day. And sometimes in the cloud they could see lightning. And that cloud and that fire were the presence of God. So they knew very clearly that God himself was among them. These people who had only ever seen evidence of other gods in Egypt, who were not living, not breathing, not moving on behalf of their people, had the presence of the holy almighty I am dwelling in their midst. And yet in chapter 11, verse 1, it says they complained. Soon the people began to complain about their hardship, and the Lord heard everything. He heard everything they said, and then the Lord's anger blazed against them, and he sent a fire to rage among them, and he destroyed some of the people in the outskirts of the camp. The people screamed to Moses for help, and when he prayed to the Lord, the fire stopped. After that, the area was known as Taberah, which means the place of burning, because the fire from the Lord had burned among them there. Then the foreign rabble who were traveling with the Israelites began to crave the good things of Egypt. And the people of Israel also began to complain. "Oh, for some meat," they exclaimed. "We remember the fish we used to eat for free in Egypt, and we had all the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic we wanted. But now our appetites are gone. All we ever see is this manna." Ugh. Very dramatic. It reminds me of my kids complaining about lunch. The manna looked like small coriander seeds, so, very tiny. And it was pale yellow like gum resin. The people would go out, they would gather it from the ground, they would make flour, they would grind it with their hand mills or pound it out in mortars, and they boiled it in a pot and made it into flat cakes. These cakes tasted like pastries baked with olive oil. The manna came down on the camp with dew during the night. Moses heard all the families standing in their doorways of their tents whining, and the Lord became extremely angry, and Moses was also aggravated. And Moses said to the Lord, "Why are you treating me, your servant, so harshly? Have mercy on me. What did I do to deserve the burden of all these people? Did I give birth to them? Did I bring them into the world? Why did you tell me to carry them in my arms like a mother carries a nursing baby? How can I carry them to the land you swore to give their ancestors? Where am I supposed to get meat for all these people? They keep whining at me, saying, 'Give us meat to eat.' And I can't carry all these people by myself. The load is far too heavy. If this is how you intend to treat me, go ahead and kill me. Do me a favor and spare me this misery." So Moses is pretty frustrated too, and I don't blame him. I mean, think about it. He's giving his life to dedicate them. He's left his family. He's left his home. His wife is with her father, and he's just running this camp of ungrateful brats at this point in time. God didn't make them till the land because they weren't staying in one place long enough to do that, to reap a harvest. God is not sending them near a river where they have to fish and catch their food. They're not even looking for wild game. It's literally falling at their feet, and all they have to do is scoop it up in the morning, and they have it all day long. And every morning God sends a fresh supply, except for on the Sabbath, where the day before he sent a double supply. So we have all of this amazing provision from God, and the people are complaining because they want more. Does that sound like something that you're familiar with? I am so guilty of that, sweet friend. Oh my word, I do it all the time. God, thank you for these amazing gifts you've given me. Thank you for all of this provision you've laid out for me. But if I could just have a little bit more, I'd really appreciate it. How often do we say that to God in his provision? And what was his response? He blazed as a fire through their camp and destroyed them. I am so glad that Jesus's sacrifice kind of tempered that side of judgment, because otherwise I would have been consumed by God's fire a long time ago. But there's something to learn here, that a malcontent heart, a complaining heart, is not something that blesses the Lord. And I know that that should be obvious, but it bears taking note. This was important enough for God to include in the scriptures for us to read the account of. So it's important enough for us to know today, and we need to look at how we can apply that. Now, the Lord gave Moses the insight to gather 70 men and to set up an authority structure there so that Moses was no longer bearing this burden alone. And that is so important. Again, community matters. We talked about that during the last week, how Aaron and Hur holding up Moses' arms, right? So that he could stand over the battle against Amalek. This was important. And without that community there, the battle would have been lost. Here's another example how community was important in running the things the way God wanted them to be. So we can't stand alone. We can't bear this burden alone. If you're a single mom and you don't have a husband to lean on, I encourage you, get out there and find another woman of the Lord who can encourage you, or a church body, or maybe even another couple where that husband can talk to your children too, and that wife can encourage you. But don't try to stand alone. And even if you are married and your husband works a lot, don't become so independent that you isolate yourself from him. Recognize that God is establishing here that even the leaders that he sets above people work best in community. Now, Moses said to the Lord, there are 600,000 foot soldiers here with me, and yet you say I will give them meat for the whole month. Even if we butchered all of our flocks and herds, would that satisfy them? If we caught all the fish in the sea, would that be enough? And the Lord said to Moses, has my arm lost its power? Now you will see whether or not my word comes true. And Moses went out and reported the Lord's word to the people. Okay, that's verse 24. He gathered the 70 elders and he stationed them around the tabernacle. And the Lord came down in the cloud and spoke to Moses. He gave the 70 elders the same spirit that was upon Moses. And when the spirit rested upon them, they prophesied. And this never happened again. This was a one-time deal, okay? 2 men, Eldad and Medad, had stayed behind in the camp, and they were listed among the elders, but had not gone out to the tabernacle. Yet the Spirit rested upon them as well, so they prophesied there in the camp. And a young man reported to Moses, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. Joshua, son of Nun, who had been Moses' assistant, protested, make them stop. But Moses replied, are you jealous for my sake? I wish that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his Spirit upon them all. Then Moses returned to the camp with the elders of Israel. So let's look here. God is promising, even in his displeasure with their discontented hearts, he promises to send meat. He surrounds Moses with a community. Moses is no longer the elder. It took 70 men, okay, that God set up as elders to do all that Moses had been doing, if we can appreciate for a moment how exhausted he was. And God said, I'm going to send meat for everybody for a month. And Moses goes, Lord, I mean, if we did everything we have, if we put it all together, we killed it all, we made it all into meat for everybody, it wouldn't even last that long. We don't have the resources for this. And God paused and said, has my arm lost its power, Moses? You will see that I will keep my word to you. God had done all of these miraculous things. He led them out of slavery. He parted the Red Sea. He killed Pharaoh's chariots. Heck, he told them to paint the doorposts with blood so that the angel of death would pass over them. They saw miraculous provision after miraculous provision. And here Moses is going, God, I think you're promising a little too much here because you're not going to be able to deliver on it. Moses needed that reminder. Has my arm lost its power? God asks him. And that is a question we need to ask ourselves. Do we ever say to God, Lord, this is just too big for you. This challenge, it's impossible. And God would respond to us, has my arm lost its power in your life? Think about that, sweet friend. I mean, really think about it. It hasn't. God is still God. And no matter how big our storm, no matter how deep our need, he is able to meet it. In verse 31, now the Lord sent a wind that brought quail from the sea and let them fall all around the camp. For miles in every direction, there were quail flying about 3 feet above the ground. And the people went out and caught the quail all that day, throughout the night, and the next day too. No one gathered less than 50 bushels. That is a lot of meat. They spread the quail all around the camp to dry, but while they were gorging themselves on the meat, while it was still in their mouths, the anger of the Lord blazed against the people, and he struck them with a severe plague. So that place was called Kibroth Hattaavah, which means graves of gluttony, because they were buried the people there who craved meat from Egypt. So God sent the provision, but there were people there who died because of their gluttony. It says while the food was still in their mouths. We need to be careful to be thankful for what God gives and to recognize the boundaries with which he gives it. Gluttony is a sin. Overindulgence is a sin. And God laid that out in Leviticus very clearly and emphasized it here in Numbers. But what we can't forget is that God provided. He heard the cries of his people, and he delights in giving his children good things. They did not need meat for sustenance. This was not an example of God providing their needs. This was an example of God oversupplying to make them happy, to bless them, to show them that they matter to him. In the New Testament, there are 2 times that Jesus takes fish and bread and multiplies it and feeds the multitude. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, right? We also know from Paul's letters that God is the God who gives blessings, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, who does more, exceedingly more, than we could ever ask or imagine. This is the God that we serve. Sweet sister, I love that you are hanging with this Bible reading challenge, and I want to challenge you. As you read this scripture, remember the I am. Remember, yesterday, today, forever, he is always the same. And that is so important as we read this, so that we can remember that this is the God that we serve. His arm has not lost its power. His provision is not bound up. And we can receive that blessing. It is amazing to me. It says that the manna came down every night. The wind blew in the quail and it fell at their feet. Even now they weren't having to work hard for it. God just gave it to them because he loves them. Look around your life today. Look at the blessings you have. See if there's some manna in your life that you've taken for granted, and thank God for it. I know sometimes I get overwhelmed by this house that I live in and the 8 people that I have to take care of. And I'm sure my husband feels that same thing. And, we've got to pick it up and we've got to cook for them and clean for them again today. Instead of going, wow, God, this is manna. We have a roof over our head, utilities on, food in the fridge and in the pantry, and 8 beautiful, beautiful mouths depending upon us to give it to them. And you enable us to be able to do that. Look at your life for that manna that you're taking for granted and find a way to thank God for it today. And even as you pray for the meat in your life, whatever those blessings are that would be your quail, when you have it, pause and thank God for it. Don't be like the Israelites who stuff it in their mouths gluttonously and then complain. Or don't stop to thank him. Look for the manna and look for the quail and thank the I am who gives them both to you. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.